Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host. You may know me from Warm Pages. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. What's the weather like where you are tonight? And do you have a little evening ritual that helps you unwind? Share it with us. I truly enjoy reading your comments. And don't forget to subscribe. Now settle in. Our story begins. Chapter 1. The Storm That Gave Up Its Dead. The storm came in from the west on a Tuesday, which Hamish Macbeth had always considered an unremarkable day of the week, and therefore a poor choice for dramatic weather. It arrived without much ceremony, as Highland storms sometimes do, not with the theatrical build-up of black clouds stacking over Ben Stack, or the polite warning of a dropping barometer, but simply as a great howling thing that materialised overnight and proceeded to batter Lochdubh with the single-minded enthusiasm of a particularly determined debt collector. Hamish had spent much of the night lying awake in the police station, listening to the wind rattle the sash windows and watching Lugs, his large ungainly dog, shift uneasily on the end of the bed. Lugs had enormous ears, the kind that made visitors assume the animal had some exotic ancestry, and those ears were pinned flat against his great head, twitching at every gust. Hamish reached down and scratched him absently behind one of the offending ears. "Aye, it's a bad one," Hamish murmured. Lugs offered no opinion, which was one of the things Hamish appreciated most about him. By morning, the storm had done its worst and retreated in the smug manner of a guest who has overstayed his welcome but still expects thanks for leaving. The village emerged cautiously into pale grey light. Gutters ran with brown water. The loch heaved and churned, and several of Mrs. Wellington's prize roses lay scattered across the main street like the aftermath of a very elegant battle. It was young Donny Macaulay, aged 14, and perpetually in search of something interesting to report, who came thundering into the police station at 9:30 with mud on his trainers and excitement written across his freckled face. "Constable Macbeth! There's bones up at the Macpherson Cliffs!" Hamish was sitting at his desk, nursing a mug of tea and contemplating the noble art of doing very little. He looked up slowly. Bones. Aye, a great chunk of the cliffside's come away in the storm. There's a grave up there, like, with a skeleton and a case and everything. Hamish set down his mug. He looked briefly, longingly, at the remaining half-inch of tea. Then he reached for his cap. The walk up to the old Macpherson Croft took 20 minutes on a fine day, with the path turned to rivulets and Lugs insisting on investigating every new smell along the way. It took 40. The Macpherson Croft itself had stood empty for 11 years, ever since old Archie Macpherson had finally succumbed to what the village had long regarded as a sheer refusal to accept medical advice. The building's stone walls remained solid, but the roof had developed opinions of its own, sagging in the middle with an air of philosophical resignation. The cliffside beyond the croft was another matter. A section of ground roughly the size of Hamish's kitchen had simply gone, slid away in the night, carrying gorse and heather and decades of compacted soil down toward the rocks below. What remained was a raw wound of exposed earth, and there, in the crumbling wall of that wound, the storm had given up what it had kept. Hamish stood at the edge and looked. The skeleton lay partially exposed, still lying in the suggestion of a hollow that had once been a shallow grave. The earth had preserved it imperfectly. Some bones had shifted, others remained in grim approximation of their original arrangement. A human being had lain here, undisturbed and unremarked, for a very long time. Beside the remains sat a rusted metal suitcase, small and travel-worn, of the kind that had been fashionable before hard-shell luggage became the province of airports and optimism. Its clasps were seized with rust, but it had held. The lock bore the remnant of a luggage tag, the ink long since surrendered to the damp, and stencilled on the case's side in faded black paint were the initials CH. Hamish crouched and examined the case without touching it, his long face thoughtful beneath his cap. Then he studied the grave itself. The depth, the positioning, the care or lack thereof that had gone into the concealment, not deep enough, done in haste, or by someone not accustomed to such work. He called Strathbane. Detective Inspector Blair took the news with his customary grace, which is to say he complained for 3 minutes about the drive, questioned whether Hamish was perhaps looking at a sheep, and announced that he would send someone eventually. Hamish thanked him with the patience of a man who has long since made peace with the particular variety of human nature represented by Blair, and set about preserving the scene. The case was opened later that afternoon, once Socko had made their reluctant appearances, and Blair had stood at the cliff edge with his hands in his pockets, looking as though the whole affair was a personal inconvenience. Inside, wrapped in oilskin that had done its job admirably against the years, were 3 items: a small bundle of yellowed letters tied with a ribbon that had once been blue, a tarnished brooch of the paste jewel variety popular in the 1980s, and a hotel key on a brass fob, heavy and old-fashioned, stamped on one side with the legend The Sutherland Arms. Room 14, 1989. 1989, said Blair, squinting at the key. So it would appear, said Hamish. That's 37 years ago, Macbeth. Your arithmetic is sound, sir. Blair shot him a look. Hamish kept his face perfectly neutral, which he had practised to considerable effect over the years. The letters were bagged without being read in the field, but Hamish had seen enough to note they were handwritten, on notepaper, and addressed in a looping feminine hand. He would not have what he wanted, a proper read of those letters, until the paperwork ground its way forward. This did not trouble him unduly. In his experience, the truth in Lochdubh rarely needed chasing. It needed only patience, and enough time spent being unremarkable in public. It was while driving back through the village that the murmuring began in earnest, as village murmuring always does, swiftly, entirely without verifiable source, and with the unhesitating confidence of collective memory. Hamish stopped in at the general store for milk, and was immediately intercepted by Mrs. Gillies, who kept the post office counter and considered the free flow of information a civic duty. "They're saying it's that girl," she said, before Hamish had made it 3 steps inside. What girl would that be, Mrs. Gillies? The one who ran off, years ago. English, she was. Mrs. Gillies lowered her voice in the way people do when they actually want to be heard more clearly. What was her name now? Cathy? Caroline? Clara, said old Angus MacLean from the far corner, where he was examining a tin of sardines with the focused attention of a man who had nowhere else to be. Her name was Clara. Hamish looked at him. You remember her? Angus set down the sardines. He had a face like a weathered fence post, deeply lined and utterly unhurried, and eyes that had spent 82 years watching things that other people missed. Oh, aye, he said quietly. I remember her fine. Pretty wee thing. Asked too many questions. He paused. That sort of thing tends to end badly in small places. Hamish bought his milk, declined Mrs. Gillies's further editorial contributions with the professional courtesy of long practice, and drove back to the police station in the early dark of the Highland afternoon, lugs pressed warm and heavy against his leg. In the kitchen, while the kettle boiled and Lugs applied himself to his supper with monastic devotion, Hamish sat at the table and thought about Clara, about a girl who had asked too many questions in a small place, 37 years ago, and had ended up in a shallow grave on a cliff above the sea. He thought about the hotel key. He thought about initials on a suitcase. He thought about Angus MacLean's quiet voice and the precise particular way he had said, "That sort of thing tends to end badly." Outside, the last of the storm's light faded over the loch, and Lochdubh settled into the hush of a village keeping its silence. The deep, practised silence of a community that has always known, on some unspoken level, that one of its secrets was not entirely gone. It was, Hamish reflected, the kind of silence that had something behind it. He poured his tea, scratched Lugs behind the ear, and wondered what Clara Hastings had discovered in the summer of 1989 that someone had thought worth killing her for. Chapter 2. The Story That Never Sat Right. The Strathbane police record system had, over the course of several decades, developed the organisational philosophy of a particularly chaotic attic. Things were technically present, but finding them required the patience of an archaeologist and the optimism of a lottery player. Hamish had driven to Strathbane on the Wednesday morning, leaving Lugs in the care of Angela Brodie, the doctor's wife, who fed the dog biscuits of a quality that Hamish could not himself afford, and who Lugs therefore regarded as a secondary deity. The drive had been scenic in the bleak and magnificent way that Highland drives are in late autumn, all pewter sky and copper bracken and the long silver glitter of the locks, and Hamish had arrived at the station in what passed for a good mood. 2 hours with the records department had done for that. The file on Clara Hastings, when it finally surfaced from a cabinet that appeared to have last been meaningfully organised during the Thatcher years, was thin, disturbingly thin. The kind of thin that, in Hamish's experience, was not the result of a simple case, but of a case that someone had decided ought to appear simple. He sat at a borrowed desk in a borrowed chair and read it through twice slowly. Clara Jane Hastings. English. Born 1965 in Exeter. 24 years old at the time of her reported disappearance in August 1989. Occupation listed as researcher, though the nature of the research had not been recorded with any enthusiasm. She had been staying at the Sutherland Arms Hotel in Lochdubh, room 14, which explained the key. She had been in the village for 11 days before she vanished. The reporting officer was a Sergeant Donald Calder, stationed at the time in the nearest town. His notes described a brief investigation, interviews with the hotel proprietor, 2 local residents, and Clara's next of kin, a sister in Bristol who had apparently accepted the verdict with the dull resignation of someone not entirely surprised. Calder had concluded that Miss Hastings had likely left voluntarily, possibly following what he described as a romantic disappointment, and that her failure to collect her belongings was consistent with emotional distress rather than foul play. Hamish read that sentence 3 times. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. A woman leaves behind a suitcase containing letters, jewellery, and a hotel key. She leaves behind, in other words, everything except herself, and the conclusion drawn is romantic disappointment. He wrote the sister's name in his notebook, Mrs. Patricia Rennie, née Hastings, and noted that she would now be in her late 60s, if she was still living at all. He drove back to Lochdubh in a more contemplative frame of mind. Angus MacLean's cottage sat at the far end of the village, separated from its neighbours by a stretch of overgrown garden that Angus had long since declared a nature reserve, though the designation was entirely self-granted and largely disregarded by the planning authority. Hamish knocked at 3 in the afternoon and was admitted with the unhurried hospitality of a man who genuinely has nowhere pressing to be. The cottage was warm and smelled of peat smoke and old paper. Angus settled into his armchair with the deliberate care of a man whose joints had developed independent opinions about movement, and regarded Hamish over the rim of a teacup. "You'll want to know about the lassie," he said before Hamish had opened his notebook, "if you're willing." Angus was willing. He was in fact in possession of the particular kind of memory that elderly Highland people sometimes have, not the blurred, obliging memory that fills gaps with comfortable invention, but a clear and stubborn recollection of things precisely as they were. He had been in his mid-40s in the summer of 1989, working the croft that his family had held for 3 generations, and he had noticed Clara Hastings the way he noticed most things, quietly and completely. She came into the village a stranger, and she stayed a stranger, Angus said. Friendly enough, mind. She'd chat to folk, buy her rounds in the Napoli. That was before Lucia changed the name, and she had a smile that made people trust her when perhaps they ought not. He paused to sip his tea. She was asking questions. What kind of questions? About land, about who owned what and when it had changed hands, about the old Dunmore estate particularly. He set down the cup. Now folk round here will talk about the weather till the cows come home, and they'll discuss their neighbours' business with equal enthusiasm. But the land is different. Land is money. Land is history. You start asking about the land, and people get quiet. Hamish wrote in his notebook. And did they get quiet with her? Some did. Some talked more than was wise. A pause. There were those who said she'd run off, took a fancy to some lad and followed him south. I never believed it. A girl who leaves her case behind is not a girl who's left of her own choosing. That's more or less my own reading, Hamish said. Angus looked at him steadily. There was a night, 2 days before she disappeared, when I was up late with a sick ewe. I heard raised voices from the direction of the cliff path, not arguing exactly, but sharp, urgent. I could not make out the words or the faces, mind. It was dark and I was not close. He added this last point with the precision of a man who wants the record to be accurate. But I heard a woman's voice, and then a man's, and then nothing. Hamish looked up from his notebook. I reported it to Calder, Angus said, and his voice carried something flat and final. He wrote it down, said he'd look into it, and that was the last I heard of it, until you came knocking this afternoon. There was nothing theatrical in the way he said it. That, somehow, made it worse. Mrs. Wellington intercepted Hamish on his way back through the village with the precision of a woman who had been watching for him. She was the minister's wife, large and well-intentioned, and possessed of the absolute certainty of someone who has never once doubted the correctness of her own instincts. "I take it you'll be looking into the girl," she announced, falling into step beside him in a manner that left little room for alternative. "I am. I remember her," said Mrs. Wellington. "She came to church. Twice, which was twice more than most of the summer visitors. I thought her very pleasant." A pause. "She asked me about the village records, the parish archives. I showed her what we had." Hamish slowed his stride. "What was she looking for?" "Births and deaths mainly, and property transfers. She was very interested in the Dunmore land. Who had it before? Who had it after?" Mrs. Wellington's expression shifted into something between confusion and belated unease. "I thought she was writing something. A history, perhaps, or a book. She had that manner about her. Academic." "Did you tell Sergeant Calder this at the time?" Mrs. Wellington stopped walking. "He never asked me," she said. And then, with the careful dignity of someone who has just understood that they missed something important 37 years ago, "He never asked me at all." Hamish thanked her and walked on, past the loch where the afternoon light was making its best effort on the water, and Lugs returned from Angela Brodie's with the faintly superior air of a dog who's been fed very well, bounded up to join him on the pavement. Calder had heard voices on a cliff path and done nothing. Calder had never asked the minister's wife what the dead girl was researching. Calder had concluded. Romantic disappointment. The Dunmore estate. Land transfers. Parish records. Clara Hastings had not come to Lochdubh for the scenery, and she had not left it of her own free will. She had come with a purpose, and someone had made very sure that purpose remained buried, along with Clara herself, in a shallow grave above the sea. Hamish walked home through the gathering dusk, Lugs at his heel, the lock at his left, and the quiet, particular weight of a case that had been tidied away settling across his shoulders like a familiar old coat that had never quite fit. He needed to speak to Sergeant Donald Calder. He suspected the conversation was going to be very interesting indeed. Chapter 3. Children of that Summer. There is a particular kind of conversation that Hamish Macbeth had learned, over many years of policing in a small Highland village, to conduct with great care. It was not the confrontational kind. He left that to Blair, who was well suited to it by temperament, and by the sheer bovine persistence with which he approached any situation involving a chair and a closed room. Nor was it the official kind, with notebooks prominently displayed, and the cold procedural language of a formal interview. The conversations that Hamish found most illuminating were the ones that did not look like conversations at all. The chat in passing on the road, the cup of tea that extended itself naturally into a second, the companionable silence in which people, feeling neither pressed nor observed, eventually said the thing they had been carrying. He spent Thursday morning thinking about who he needed to talk to, and by lunchtime he had a list. In 1989, Lochdubh had been a village of perhaps 200 souls, smaller even than it was now, quieter, less touched by the self-conscious tourism that had in subsequent decades given the Highlands a certain artisanal veneer. The people who had been young then, in their late teens and 20s, were now in their mid-50s and early 60s. Several had left, a handful had stayed. 4 names surfaced from his inquiries with the consistency of flotsam rising after a storm, and those 4 he visited across the course of Thursday and Friday, working at the unhurried pace that in Lochdubh passed for urgency. Fiona McRae he found at the Sutherland Arms itself, the hotel where Clara Hastings had stayed, and which Fiona now owned outright, having inherited it from her parents a decade ago. It was a solid building of grey stone, sitting above the harbour with the enduring self-possession of a structure that has seen out many a difficult winter. Fiona herself matched the building in certain respects. Solid, handsome, with close-cropped dark hair gone silver at the temples and the sharp, assessing eyes of someone who has spent 30 years watching guests and making calculations. She received Hamish in the small office behind the reception desk, offered him nothing, and sat with her arms folded across her chest in a posture that managed to convey polite cooperation and profound reluctance simultaneously. "I remember her," Fiona said, when Hamish raised Clara's name. She was a guest here for nearly a fortnight, paid on time, kept her room tidy, had her breakfast at 8 every morning without fail. A pause that was precisely 1 beat too long. She was perfectly pleasant. "Did you speak with her much?" "I was working. I spoke to all the guests." "Did she mention what had brought her to Lochdubh?" "Research," she said. Fiona's expression was neutral in the deliberate way of someone who has practiced neutrality. "I didn't ask what kind. It wasn't my business." Hamish nodded, wrote nothing in particular, and changed the subject to the storm damage, which Fiona discussed with considerably more animation. He left 20 minutes later with a distinct impression that Fiona McRae was a woman who chose her words the way a careful climber chooses handholds, slowly and with significant attention to what lay below. Dougal Ferguson was on his boat when Hamish found him, mending net on the harbour wall with the focused application of a man who prefers work to conversation. He was broad-shouldered and weathered, with a beard that appeared to have been growing since approximately 1994, and he had the particular restless quality of someone whose temper is always somewhere nearby, waiting to be called upon. He listened to Hamish's questions about Clara with an expression that was difficult to read. "Aye, I knew her," he said, not looking up from the net. "We all did. Village this size, you know everyone who comes through." "She speak to you much?" "Some." A knot tightened. "She asked me about the fishing, about the coastline, said she was interested in the local geography." He snorted slightly. "She wasn't interested in the fishing." "What was she interested in?" Dougal looked up then, directly. His eyes were grey and flat as the loch on a still day. "She asked me about the Dunmore headland, who had the grazing rights above the cliff, who had sold what to whom." He held Hamish's gaze for a moment, then looked back at the net. "I told her I didn't know," which was the truth. It may or may not have been. Hamish thanked him and moved on. Morag Sinclair was easier to find and easier to read, being the sort of person whose face registers feeling with the transparency of a shallow burn. You could see straight to the bottom. She had spent 30 years teaching primary school in Lochdubh and had the particular quality of stillness that comes from decades of explaining things patiently to small children, an absolute refusal to be flustered, and a deep instinct for when someone was not telling the truth. She met Hamish in her front room, surrounded by bookshelves, and offered him shortbread, which he accepted with genuine gratitude. "Clara Hastings," Morag said softly, turning the name over as though reacquainting herself with it. "I thought about her for years after, wondered what became of her." Her hands, wrapped around her own teacup, tightened briefly. "And now I suppose we know. What was she like, to your memory?" Morag considered carefully. "Intelligent, very, and watchful, in the way that intelligent people sometimes are when they are learning more than they are letting on. She was friendly, genuinely I think, not as performance. But there was something underneath it, a pause. She seemed frightened toward the end of her stay, not obviously, but I noticed. Hamish set down his shortbread. Frightened of what? I don't know. She came to me. I think because I was young and she trusted me, and because I wasn't part of whatever she was looking into. She said she'd found something she hadn't expected and that she needed to be careful about what she did next. Morag met his eyes steadily. I told her to telephone someone, a friend, a family member. She said she would. A short silence. She was dead within 2 days. Hamish drove to see Alistair Grant in the early evening, at the large and well-appointed house on the edge of the village that spoke quietly but firmly of inherited money made comfortable. Alistair had become a local councillor some years back, and bore the smooth, careful manner of a man who had learned to present himself as a public asset. He was 61, silver-haired, and impeccably courteous, and he offered Hamish a glass of whisky, which Hamish declined on principle. "Of course I remember the summer," Alistair said, settling into an armchair with easy confidence. "Dreadful business when she vanished. We were all upset." "You spoke with her?" "Briefly. At the hotel, I think, once or twice. She seemed pleasant enough." He swirled his own whisky. "I can't say I knew her well. I was busy that summer. Family business, land matters. The usual." He smiled, and the smile reached his eyes in a way that Hamish found, without being able to explain why, less reassuring than the absence of one would have been. "Land matters," Hamish said, with the tone of a man making a trivial observation. "The estate. Sorting out various transfers after my father's dealings. Nothing dramatic." The whisky was sipped with perfect composure. "Is it relevant?" "Probably not," said Hamish agreeably. Walking back through the village in the cool of the evening, Lugs trotting ahead with his nose applied to the pavement with professional dedication, Hamish sorted through what he had gathered. 4 people who had been young in the summer of 1989, 4 different versions of Clara Hastings. Charming, secretive, frightened, unremarkable. 4 memories that disagreed at precisely the points where agreement would have been most useful. Fiona, who had been too careful. Dougal, who had known more than he admitted. Morag, whose account had the cold, unhappy ring of truth. And Alistair, whose composure had been entirely untroubled, which in Hamish's experience was either the sign of innocence or of someone who had spent 37 years making their peace with the decision. The lights of Lochdubh reflected in the black water of the harbour. A light burned in the Sutherland Arms. Hamish thought about a girl who'd been frightened and careful, and dead within 2 days of saying so. He thought about land matters, sorted out at great convenience shortly after. He thought about the letters, still bagged in Strathbane, which he had not yet been permitted to read. He was going to need those letters. Chapter 4. A Warning in the Night. The letters arrived at Lochdubh police station on Saturday morning, released at last from Strathbane with the reluctant air of a bank releasing funds it would rather have kept. Blair had telephoned the previous evening to inform Hamish that the forensic examination had found nothing conclusive. The paper was consistent with the late 1980s. The handwriting had been confirmed as belonging to Clara Hastings by comparison with her university records, and the contents were, in Blair's considered assessment, a lot of personal nonsense that will only help anybody. He had pronounced this with the satisfaction of a man who enjoys closing doors, and had added that Hamish was to treat the letters as evidence, and not go making photocopies of everything like he usually did. Hamish had thanked him with the sincerity reserved for such occasions, and spent Saturday morning at his kitchen table with the letters spread before him, a fresh pot of tea at his elbow, and Lugs stretched across his feet like a draught excluder of considerable warmth and indifferent usefulness. There were 7 letters in total, all written by Clara to an unnamed recipient, a close friend from the Tone, possibly the sister in Bristol, and never sent. They read less like correspondence than like a private record, as though Clara had been thinking aloud on paper, the way some people do when they cannot sleep, and the thoughts need somewhere to go. The early letters were cheerful enough. She described Lochdubh with the appreciative eye of someone discovering a place she had not expected to love. The quality of the light on the loch, the particular Highland quality of silence that is not really silence at all, but a complex arrangement of wind and water and distant sheep. She mentioned the hotel's excellent porridge. She mentioned a fisherman who had tried to teach her to tie a particular knot, and given up in genial defeat. Then, in the fourth letter, the tone shifted. She had found what she came for, or something very like it. The details were careful. Clara had clearly been aware that the letters might be read, but the shape of the thing was visible. She had been researching land transfers in the Dunmore coastal area, following a trail that had begun, she wrote, with a legal document she had discovered while working as a researcher for a firm of Edinburgh solicitors. The document suggested that a parcel of coastal land, valuable, with development potential even in 1989, and considerably more so now, had been transferred under circumstances that did not bear close examination, signatures that did not match earlier examples, a date that conflicted with a death certificate, the kind of discrepancy that could be explained away individually but, taken together, suggested something deliberate. In the fifth letter, she wrote that she had spoken to someone about it. She did not name the person. She wrote only that the conversation had not gone as she had hoped, and that she was going to have to decide what to do next. The sixth letter was short and written in a different hand than the rest. Not a different person's hand, but Clara's own hand changed. Quicker, less careful, the letters cramped together as they are when someone is writing in a hurry or in distress. She'd been followed, she thought, on the cliff path. Someone had come to her room while she was at dinner and gone through her papers, though nothing had been taken. She was going to leave in 2 days. She was going to take everything with her. The seventh letter was 3 lines long. She had decided to confront the matter directly, she wrote. She believed she knew who was responsible. She was going to meet with them and make clear what she intended to do with the information. She wrote that she was not afraid, which Hamish read as meaning, with some certainty, that she was. He sat with the final letter for a long time after he had finished reading it. Outside, Lochdubh went about its Saturday with the cheerful indifference of a village that does not know it is being watched. Mrs. Gillies was arranging a display of tinned goods in the shop window with an aesthetic ambition considerably in excess of the materials available. Archie MacLean, no relation to old Angus, was repainting his gate in a shade of green that his wife had allegedly chosen, and that he was clearly having second thoughts about. The loch lay flat and pale under a sky the colour of old pewter, and a single heron stood at the water's edge with the profound stillness of a philosopher who has run out of questions. Hamish returned the letters carefully to their evidence bags and went to the back of the station, where the small room used for storage also served, in a crisis, as a filing space for material he preferred not to leave at Strathbane. He had placed the letters on the old trestle table there the previous evening, along with the bagged brooch, and a set of photographs taken at the cliff scene. The brooch and the photographs were exactly where he had left them. The letters were not. They had been moved, not removed, he noted with the particular attention that Highland constables develop for the precise arrangement of objects left in imperfectly supervised spaces, but shifted. The stack was 2 inches further left than he had placed it. The top bag had been rotated slightly. Someone had handled the letters and replaced them with the intention of appearing not to have done so, and had not quite succeeded. Hamish stood in the doorway of the storage room and considered this for a moment with the stillness of a man who is thinking hard and moving not at all. The station had been locked. The windows were intact. The only other key to the building was kept on a hook in the back office of the Strathbane station, on the grounds that Blair might conceivably need access in an emergency, an occasion that had never, in 12 years, arisen. Someone had either picked the lock with enough competence to leave no mark, or had access to a key that should not have been accessible. It was while he was standing there, constructing the dimensions of this problem, that he noticed the note. It was tucked beneath the remaining photographs, a small rectangle of paper, folded once, plain white, the kind available in every printer in every home and office in the country. The message was brief and unambiguous, and had been written in block capitals with the deliberate impersonality of someone who understood that handwriting identifies. Let the past lie, Macbeth. He read it twice, picked it up by the corner using the pen from his breast pocket, and placed it in a fresh evidence bag with the calm efficiency of someone who is not entirely surprised. Then he made himself another cup of tea, because it was that sort of morning. He was still sitting with it, doing the thinking that looked from the outside like doing nothing, when the telephone rang. It was Fiona McRae, and her voice had lost every trace of the careful composure she had displayed 2 days ago in her office. It was tighter now, clipped with an agitation she was clearly making an effort to control. "Someone has been in my office," she said. "Last night. The back window has been forced and the old guest registers have been gone through. I keep them in the bottom cupboard, 20 years of them at least, and they've all been pulled out and left in a heap. Were any taken?" A pause. "I can't be certain, but the ones from 1988 and 1989 are not where they should be." Hamish set down his tea. "Don't touch anything else. I'll be there shortly." He arrived to find Fiona standing in her office doorway with her arms folded, and the expression of someone who has moved beyond agitation into a colder and more useful state. The back window had been forced with something thin and flat, a knife or a letter opener, with enough skill to suggest practice. The guest registers from the relevant years were indeed absent. Someone, Hamish reflected, was engaged in a quiet and determined campaign of erasure. The note in his storage room, the registers from the hotel. 2 tidy attempts to remove the footprints that Clara Hastings had left in Lochdubh's history. It was, he thought, the behaviour of someone who believed that the truth could still be buried if enough of its evidence was cleared away, which meant that whoever had written "Let the past lie" was also someone who understood, with uncomfortable clarity, exactly what the past contained. He stood at the forced window and looked out at the grey harbour and the anchored boats rocking gently on the tide. The past, in his experience, very rarely stayed where people put it. This particular past had already clawed its way out of a cliff once. He rather thought it would do so again. Chapter 5. Echoes and Evasions. Sergeant Donald Calder lived in a bungalow outside Bonner Bridge, in the kind of determined retirement that involves a great deal of gardening and very little reflection on the past. The garden was impressive, Hamish had to admit, as he pulled the Land Rover onto the gravel drive on Monday morning. Even in late autumn, when most Highland gardens had given themselves over to the contemplation of mud, Calder's was trim and purposeful, the beds cut back with military precision, the lawn edge so sharply it appeared to have been achieved with a set square. It was the garden of a man who had redirected his considerable energies from one kind of order to another. Calder himself answered the door before Hamish had finished knocking, which suggested he had seen the Land Rover coming up the lane. He was in his late 70s, spare and white-haired, with the slightly sunken look of someone whose frame had been built for a heavier man and was now making do. His eyes, however, were as sharp as his lawn edges, and they assessed Hamish with the instantaneous, involuntary judgment of an old policeman who cannot help himself. "Macbeth," he said. Not a question. "Mr. Calder, I appreciate you seeing me. I assumed you'd come eventually." He stood aside. "You'd better come in then." The sitting room smelled of furniture polish and old paperbacks. A coal-effect electric fire glowed in the grate with the synthetic enthusiasm of something trying very hard to pass for the real thing. Calder settled into an upright chair with the careful movements of a man managing some persistent discomfort, folded his hands in his lap, and waited. Hamish had decided on the drive over that the indirect approach would be wasted on a retired police sergeant. He placed the facts on the table between them like cards, the skeleton, the suitcase, the letters, the note left in his station, the missing guest registers. Calder listened without interrupting. His expression did not change in any way that could have been described or measured, but something behind it shifted. Not guilt exactly, and not surprise, but the particular alteration of a man who has been waiting a long time for a specific knock on a specific door, and is now making peace with the fact that it has finally come. When Hamish finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to acquire a character of its own. "The case was closed because it was convenient for it to be closed," Calder said at last. His voice was flat and careful, carrying none of the defensive heat that Hamish had half expected. "Not by me. I want to be clear on that. I filed what I found. My superintendent at the time reviewed it and determined that there was insufficient evidence of foul play, and that pursuing the matter further would not serve the public interest." A pause that held something dry and unhappy. Those were his words, "not serve the public interest." And you accepted that. I was 34 years old, and I had a wife and 2 children, and a career that I had not finished building. He said it without self-pity and without excuse, in the manner of a man stating a fact about a person he has since had occasion to think poorly of. "I accepted it. I should not have. I have known that for 37 years. Hamish said nothing, which was frequently more productive than saying something. Calder unclenched his hands and reclenched them. "The pressure came from above my superintendent. I never knew the precise source, but there were telephone calls made and visits paid, and the result was that a missing young woman became a voluntary runaway in the official record." He looked at the fire. "I spoke to Angus MacLean. He told me about the voices on the cliff path. I wrote it in my notes. I was told to remove it." "But you didn't remove it entirely." The old man looked at him then with a faint wintry acknowledgement. "No, I reworded it, buried it in the middle of a paragraph about tidal conditions. Anyone skimming the file would miss it entirely." A pause. "I suppose you didn't miss it." "I didn't miss it," Hamish agreed. Calder told him what he remembered of the interviews he'd conducted. He had spoken to the hotel proprietor, Fiona McRae's mother, long since dead, who had described Clara as a courteous guest with a habit of early rising and a keen interest in the landscape. He had spoken to a local farmer whose land bordered the Dunmore headland, who had been aggressively unhelpful. He had attempted to speak to the Grant family, whose patriarch had refused an interview and whose solicitor had telephoned the station the following morning to inquire, with considerable politeness and evident menace, about the scope of the investigation. Malcolm Grant, Calder said, Alistair's father. He was a man of considerable local influence at the time, councillor, landowner, known to half the county, the sort of man whose telephone calls were returned promptly. Hamish wrote the name in his notebook below the others. And the land transfers Clara was investigating. "I never saw the documents she'd found. Whatever she had brought with her was not in the case when we recovered it. Only the personal effects." He paused. "Someone had been through it before we had." Hamish drove back through the moorland in the slate-grey afternoon, turning this over. The documents Clara had found, the original evidence of the fraudulent transfer, had been removed from the suitcase at some point between her death and the case's recovery. Whoever had buried her had been thorough enough to extract the one piece of evidence that pointed most directly at motive. He stopped in Lochdubh at the community hall where he had arranged, with some diplomacy, to borrow the parish records that Mrs. Wellington had mentioned in their earlier conversation. They were kept in a cardboard box of no great archival ambition, and Hamish spent 2 hours at a folding table working through them, while the hall's overhead strip lighting flickered at irregular intervals with the rhythm of something that had given up and not yet been told. The land records were sparse but navigable. The Dunmore coastal parcel, a stretch of headland and cliff running nearly half a mile, had been the subject of a transfer in November 1989, 3 months after Clara's disappearance. It had passed from the estate of a Mrs. Effie Dunbar, deceased, into the ownership of a private company whose registered address was in Edinburgh. Hamish wrote down the company name, Coastal Development Holdings Limited. A second transfer, in 1991, had moved the land from the company into the direct ownership of Malcolm Grant. Hamish sat back in the plastic chair and looked at the ceiling. Effie Dunbar. He wrote the name down. Deceased before the transfer, which was how these things were arranged when they were arranged dishonestly. The dead do not contest signatures made in their names. He called Angela Brodie that evening, partly because Angela was the kind of person who knew things about the village that predated her own residence in it, and partly because Luggs had been staying with her for the day, and Hamish needed to collect him before she fed the animal anything else that would make him impossible to live with. Angela met him at the door with the dog and the information he needed in approximately equal measure. "Effie Dunbar," she said, taking the question with the easy recall of someone for whom village history is a living subject rather than an archive. "Old woman who lived out past the Macpherson Croft. No family left, I believe. She died in the spring of 1989. A thoughtful pause. "People said she was confused toward the end of her life, didn't always know what she was signing." Hamish collected Luggs, who smelled strongly of biscuits and contentment, and drove the short distance home through the dark village. Someone had ensured that an elderly confused woman's land, valuable coastal land, was transferred before her death could be properly administered. Clara Hastings had found the evidence of this. She had come to Lochdubh to verify it, or to confront whoever had arranged it, or both. She had met instead with someone who had a great deal to lose and very little patience for the complications that an honest young researcher from Exeter might introduce into a 37-year inheritance. The shape of the crime was becoming visible now, the way the coastline becomes visible as the Har burns off, not all at once but incrementally, the outlines emerging from the grey before the details arrived. What Hamish needed next was proof. What he suspected he was going to find first was something considerably worse. Chapter 6. A Body in the Harbour. The call came at 6:20 on a Tuesday morning, which Hamish had always considered an unreasonable hour for bad news, though in his experience bad news paid no particular attention to the preferences of those receiving it. It was young Donny Macaulay again, the same boy who had come breathless to the station about the bones on the cliff, and who was fast developing the kind of relationship with local catastrophe that suggested either an exceptional run of bad luck or an instinct for being in the wrong place at the most dramatically significant moment. This time his voice on the telephone was different. The excitement of the cliff discovery had been the excitement of novelty, the pure, uncomplicated thrill of the unexpected. This was something else entirely. "It's Dougal Fergusson," said. "His boat's in, but he's not on his feet. I thought he was sleeping, but he's not sleeping, Constable Macbeth. He's not sleeping at all." Hamish, dressed in the dark, told Luggs to stay, an instruction the dog received with the resigned dignity of one accustomed to being excluded from the interesting parts, and walked down to the harbour in the cold pre-dawn. The Morag Jean, Dougal's boat, was a 30-foot fishing vessel of indeterminate age and resolute functionality, painted blue in the way of boats that have been repainted blue many times, each coat sitting atop the last like geological strata. She was moored at the far end of the harbour wall, which was where Dougal always moored her, and she sat low and steady on the black water in the manner of a thing that does not know its owner is dead. Dougal was in the wheelhouse, slumped sideways against the instrument panel in what might, to an incurious eye, have looked like the posture of a man who had drunk considerably and fallen asleep before making it to somewhere more comfortable. There was a half-empty whisky bottle on the floor nearby, and a glass had rolled into the corner, and the general arrangement of these items had a slightly considered quality that Hamish noticed immediately, and filed away with the quiet efficiency of a man who has learned to trust the things he notices. He did not touch anything. He stood in the wheelhouse doorway and looked at Dougal Fergusson, at the broad weathered face slack in death, at the hands that had spent 40 years hauling nets and mending rope now folded uselessly at his sides, and he felt the particular sadness that comes not from shock, but from the recognition that something was already in motion, and could not now be stopped. He called it in, and then he waited. The pathologist from Strathbane arrived 2 hours later, by which time the harbour had accumulated the small attentive crowd that any unusual event in Lochdubh will generate before breakfast. Mrs. Gillies was present, naturally. So was Angela Brodie, who had the professional composure of someone married to a doctor, and the personal composure of someone who had seen Hamish through enough investigations to know when to stay out of the way, and when a cup of tea in a flask would be appreciated. She handed one to Hamish over the harbour wall without comment, which he accepted with genuine gratitude. Blair arrived an hour after the pathologist, in a car driven by a young detective constable, who had the carefully blank expression of someone who had spent 3 hours in a confined space with Detective Inspector Blair and was managing this fact through sheer inner resource. "Drunk fisherman falls in his own wheelhouse," Blair announced, surveying the scene with the satisfaction of a man reaching a conclusion before examining the evidence. "It happens." "It does happen," Hamish agreed. Blair looked at him with the wariness that long acquaintance had rightly bred. "But you're going to tell me something that complicates that." "I might mention the bruising. The pathologist, a precise and patient woman named Dr. Ferguson, who had dealt with Hamish and Blair as a professional pairing long enough to have developed coping strategies for both, had noted during her preliminary examination a pattern of bruising on Dougal's left shoulder and upper back that was inconsistent with a simple fall. The marks were the kind produced by impact with something rounded and hard, a railing perhaps, or a length of pipe, applied with force sufficient to stagger a large man. There was also, she noted carefully, a contusion at the base of the skull that was positioned in a manner she would wish to examine more thoroughly before making any definitive statements, but that she would not at this preliminary stage describe as obviously consistent with an accidental fall. Blair absorbed this with the expression of a man whose straightforward Tuesday was developing complications. "You'll want to look at the arrangement of the whisky bottle," Hamish said, in the tone he used when he was pointing at something Blair would rather not look at. "The glass rolled to the corner, but the bottle is upright. A man who's drunk enough to fall doesn't set his bottle carefully upright before he falls." Blair looked at the bottle. He looked at Hamish. He looked at the sky, briefly, in the manner of a man appealing to a higher authority that consistently fails to intervene on his behalf. Then he told the DC to make it a murder inquiry and went to find somewhere to sit down. Hamish walked back through the village in the thin morning light, past the shop where Mrs. Gillies was now dispensing the early reports of the discovery, with the brisk authority of a news service that values speed over accuracy, past the church where the minister's car sat in the drive, indicating that word had reached Mrs. Wellington and therefore the minister, and up the brae toward the police station. He sat at his kitchen table and thought about Dougal Ferguson. Dougal, who had been evasive about Clara Hastings and the questions she had asked about the Dunmore headland. Dougal, who had said, with the particular flatness of someone choosing their words with care, that he didn't know anything about the land, which was not the same as saying he had nothing to do with the land. Dougal, who fished the coastline below those cliffs every week of his working life, and who would, over the course of 40 years, have had ample opportunity to notice things about the ground above them, including perhaps a disturbed patch of earth on a cliff top where no reasonable person had any business digging. The thought arrived with the cold clarity of the obvious. Dougal had known, or suspected, that Clara was up there. He had kept the knowledge the way people in small places sometimes keep dangerous knowledge, buried and silent, because the person who put it there was still present and still capable. And then, when the storm had done what storms do and removed the ground above the grave, Dougal had looked at the news from the cliff and made a calculation. Perhaps he'd decided finally that 37 years was long enough. Perhaps he had made a telephone call, or paid a visit, or said something to someone that indicated he was done keeping the secret. Whatever he had done, someone had decided he could not be permitted to continue doing it. The second murder, staged as the first had been staged, as accident, as misadventure, as the unremarkable end of a man with a taste for whisky and a small boat, was a message as much as a crime. It said, "I have done this before." It said, "I am not finished." It said, quite clearly to the one person in Lochdubh who was paying close attention, "I know you are looking, and I am not afraid of you." Hamish made a note of every conversation he had had since Monday, and the precise order in which he had had them. He thought about who knew what, and when they had come to know it. and which of the 4 people he had interviewed in the past week had been present when he mentioned his interest in the Dunmore land and the 1989 transfers? The answer, when he arrived at it, was all of them, which meant the field had not narrowed at all, which meant, he reflected, setting down his pen and reaching for what remained of Angela's flask, that the next step would need to be something other than conversation. He needed to know who had owned Coastal Development Holdings Limited in the autumn of 1989. He needed to find out whether the company's registered agent in Edinburgh was still living, and he needed, with some urgency, to have another conversation with Alistair Grant. Chapter 7. The Shape of the First Crime. The company's house records for Coastal Development Holdings Limited took 48 hours to obtain, which in Hamish's experience was considerably faster than most bureaucratic processes and considerably slower than a murder investigation ideally required. He had requested them through official channels, which meant through Blair, which meant with a delay occasioned by Blair's initial opinion that it was unnecessary, his subsequent opinion that it was premature, and his final opinion, arrived at after Hamish had presented the connection between the company and Malcolm Grant's land acquisition, with the patient thoroughness of a man laying out a jigsaw for someone who does not believe in puzzles, that it was probably Hamish's own idea, and therefore not something Blair could take credit for. The paperwork was filed on Wednesday, and the records arrived on Thursday, and Hamish read them at the kitchen table, while Luggs applied himself to a beef bone with focused and appreciative attention. Coastal Development Holdings Limited had been incorporated in Edinburgh in March 1989, 6 months before the Dunmore land transfer, and 5 months before Clara Hastings arrived in Lochdubh. The registered director was listed as a Mr. Gordon Rutherford, with an address in the new town. The company secretary was a solicitor's firm on George Street whose name Hamish noted and underlined. There were 2 shareholders of record. Rutherford held 60%. The remaining 40% was held by a second party, listed under a nominee name that was the corporate equivalent of a middle-distance stare. Technically present, entirely uninformative. Gordon Rutherford, when Hamish tracked him through a telephone call to the Edinburgh solicitor's firm, now operating under a different name but still, as institutions of that kind tend to be, occupying the same address, turned out to be deceased. He had died in 2003 of a heart attack, leaving behind a wife, 2 adult children, and an estate that the firm's senior partner described, with the careful language of someone who has learned to say things without quite saying them, as having been the subject of some complexity at the time of probate. The senior partner, a measured and quietly careful man named MacPhail, was prepared to confirm that Rutherford had acted as a nominee director on occasion for various clients throughout his career, and that Coastal Development Holdings had been one such arrangement. He was not prepared to confirm the identity of the beneficial owner without a formal court order, and he said so with the regret of a man who is genuinely sorry to be unhelpful, and the firmness of one who has a professional indemnity policy and intends to respect it. Hamish thanked him, rang off, and considered what he had. A nominee director, a 40% shareholding held under a nominee name, a company that existed for precisely long enough to receive the Dunmore land and transfer it onward to Malcolm Grant. It had the clean, purposeful architecture of an arrangement designed to be difficult to trace. Not impossible, but difficult, and in 1989 considerably more so than it would be today. Clara Hastings had been a researcher for an Edinburgh solicitor's firm. She had found the original discrepancy in a legal document. The document that had set her on this trail would have been something that crossed the desk of her employers, a transfer, a will, a probate query, something that connected Effie Dunbar's estate to Coastal Development Holdings in a way that did not quite add up. She had followed the thread to Lochdubh, verified what she suspected, and then, in the manner of someone who perhaps trusted in the reasonableness of guilty parties more than was warranted, had decided to confront the matter directly. Hamish drove to see Alistair Grant on Thursday afternoon, in the unhurried manner of a man making a social call, which was an approach he had found generally more productive than the alternative when dealing with people who had solicitors on retainer. Grant received him in the same well-furnished sitting room as before, with the same easy courtesy, and offered whisky again, which Hamish declined again, and tea, which he accepted. The fire was burning with real logs this time, which Hamish noted as a detail consistent with a man who had recently developed a need for comfort. "Your father incorporated a company in the spring of 1989, Hamish said, when they were settled and the tea had been poured with the deliberate hospitality of the host controlling the pace. Coastal Development Holdings. It acquired the Dunmore coastal land from Effie Dunbar's estate in November of that year, and transferred it to your father personally 2 years later." Alistair's expression did not fracture. It was a considerable feat of composure, and Hamish gave him credit for it. "My father managed a great many business interests," he said. "I wasn't involved in the details. I was 24. You were in Lochdubh that summer, though, as I've told you." Clara Hastings had documented evidence of irregularities in the Dunbar transfer. Effie Dunbar's signature on the relevant documents appears to have been obtained while she was experiencing significant cognitive decline. Hamish set his teacup down with the precision of someone placing a card on a table. "Clara came here to verify the evidence in person. She spoke to several people. She told Morag Sinclair she had found what she was looking for and that she intended to confront the matter directly." A pause. "She was dead within 2 days. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, a gull called once and fell silent." "I had nothing to do with that woman's death," Alistair said. His voice had changed register, still controlled, but with something beneath it now, working against the control the way a current works against a swimmer who is very nearly but not quite strong enough. "What happened on that cliff was nothing to do with me." Hamish looked at him steadily. "Did she come to you?" The silence that followed was not the silence of a man considering his answer. It was the silence of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for so long that the moment of setting it down has arrived before he was ready for it. "She came to the house," Alistair said at last. "This house, my father's house, at the time. I answered the door. She asked to speak to my father about the Dunmore land. She was composed, direct. She had documents with her in a folder." He stopped. "My father was not at home. I told her to leave and that she should not come back." "And did she leave?" "She left." Something crossed his face that was not quite grief and not quite shame, but contained elements of both. "I telephoned my father at his club in Inverness. I told him what she'd said, what she had." "And what did he say?" Another pause. "He said he would handle it." Alistair looked at the fire now rather than at Hamish, and when he spoke again his voice had the quality of a confession that has been rehearsed privately for a very long time and is still, at the moment of delivery, more difficult than anticipated. "I did not ask him what he meant by that. I told myself he would speak to her, perhaps pay her off. I was 24 years old, and I did not want to know." He looked up. "But I knew. In the way that you know things when you have decided not to examine them. I knew." Hamish said nothing. He had found, over the years, that some confessions needed space around them. "When she vanished," Alistair continued, I was sick with it. I could not sleep for months. But I was my father's son, and the land was in our name, and if I said anything, I said everything. I had no proof of what he had done, only what I suspected." He met Hamish's eyes with the directness of a man who has stopped performing. "I have lived with that every day since." Hamish drove back through the autumn dark with the shape of the first crime now fully assembled in his mind. Malcolm Grant had met Clara on the cliff path, or sent someone who had. The confrontation had turned fatal. The grave had been dug in haste, the suitcase stripped of its most dangerous contents and buried with the body. The official inquiry had been suppressed by a telephone call from a man of local influence to a superintendent who valued the public interest as expressed in donations to the right causes. A clean crime, efficiently managed, in a village that had learned, as villages do, to look at what it was shown and not at what lay behind it. Alistair Grant had not pushed Clara Hastings off a cliff, but Malcolm Grant, Hamish was now certain, had. And somewhere in this village was a second person who had helped stage what happened next, and who had killed Dougal Ferguson last Tuesday to ensure it stayed staged. Malcolm Grant had died in 2011. He could answer for nothing now, but his accomplice was still here, and they had just made their second mistake. Chapter 8. Another shadow emerges. Hamish had a whiteboard. It was not an official whiteboard. It was, in fact, a sheet of white melamine salvaged from a broken wardrobe that had been left outside the village hall 3 years ago, propped now against the wall of the police station's back room between a filing cabinet and a box of emergency road cones that had never, in Hamish's tenure, been called upon for an emergency. He used it when a case developed the kind of complexity that benefited from being visible, and he found it considerably more useful than the flowchart software that Strathbane occasionally urged upon its officers with the evangelical enthusiasm of people who had recently attended a technology seminar. On Friday morning he stood before it with a marker pen and looked at what he had. Malcolm Grant, deceased 2011, committed the first murder, beneficiary of the land fraud, suppressed the investigation through influence. Alistair Grant, present in 1989, informed his father of Clara's visit, guilty of knowledge and silence, not guilty, on the evidence available, of anything more. Coastal Development Holdings Limited, instrument of the fraud. Gordon Rutherford, nominee director, deceased 2003, beneficial owner still unconfirmed. Fiona McRae, too careful, access to the hotel records, hotel built on land adjacent to the Dunmore parcel, broke into her own office, or had her office broken into, both possibilities. Dougal Ferguson knew something, kept it 37 years, talked or threatened to talk after the cliff discovery, murdered Tuesday morning. Unknown second party, helped stage Clara's death in 1989, killed Dougal Ferguson in the present day, left the note, removed the guest registers. He underlined the final entry. The second party was the operative problem. Malcolm Grant had been capable of many things, but he had not, from everything Hamish had gathered, been the kind of man who buried bodies with his own hands. He would have required assistance of a practical kind, from someone close enough to be trusted and compromised enough to have no choice but to provide it. He was still looking at the board when Morag Sinclair arrived at his door, which she did with the quiet decisiveness of someone who has spent the night deciding to do something and has arrived before the daylight could change her mind. She sat across the kitchen table from him, with her hands folded and her face composed in the particular way of people who are about to say something they have not said before. "I should have told you this when you came to the house," she said. "I thought about it after you left, and I have thought about little else since." Hamish set down his pen. "Take your time." "My brother Callum was in love with Clara Hastings." She said it plainly, without drama, as a statement of historical fact that had been a private one for too long. Callum Sinclair. Hamish did not have the name on his board. He waited. Morag was 58 years old, measured and deliberate, and she told the story of her brother with the careful chronology of someone who has assembled it accurately from memory precisely because they knew the day would come when it would need to be told accurately. Callum had been 22 in the summer of 1989, 2 years older than Morag, unemployed after a short stint at a fish processing plant in Wick, returned to Lochdubh with no particular plan, and the restless unhappiness of a young man who did not know what he wanted, and felt the smallness of his circumstances with unnecessary acuteness. Clara Hastings had arrived in the village like weather, sudden, vivid, impossible to ignore. Callum had spoken to her at the hotel bar on her second evening in Lochdubh, and had not stopped thinking about her since. He was not her equal, Morag said, and there was old sorrow in the phrase rather than cruelty. Not in education, not in purpose, not in the direction of his life. She was kind to him, genuinely kind, I think, but she was not interested in him the way he was interested in her. He could not see that. Did he become a problem for her? Morag's hands tightened slightly. He followed her. Not constantly, not threateningly, or at least not in any way she reported to anyone. But he would appear wherever she went, on the cliff path, at the harbour, outside the hotel in the evenings. A pause. I spoke to him about it. He said he was simply keeping an eye on her, that he was worried about her safety. Another pause. He was very worried about her safety. And after she disappeared, he was destroyed, genuinely destroyed. He did not eat properly for months. He became convinced she had been harmed and that the police were not investigating properly, which was, as it turns out, not a delusion. Something complicated crossed her face. He began to drink. Within 2 years he had left Lochdubh entirely. He moved to Glasgow. We were not close after that. She smoothed an invisible crease in her sleeve. He died in 2004. His liver had given up long before he did. Hamish sat with this for a moment. Did he ever say anything to you? Anything at all? About what happened to Clara? About who might have been responsible? Morag looked at him directly. Once. In 1991, when he had been drinking and his guard was down, he said that he had seen her on the cliff path on the last evening, that she had been arguing with a man and that he had watched from the gorse and done nothing because he thought it was a private quarrel and he had no right to interfere. Her voice was steady, with the effort of making it so. He said the man had pushed her and that she had fallen and that he, Callum, had run. He had run, and he had told no one, because he was frightened and ashamed, and because he did not know whose name to give the police or whether they would believe him. The kitchen was very quiet. He described the man, Morag said. Older than Clara, tall, well-dressed, which meant something in a village where well-dressed was unusual. Dark coat. She paused. He said the man had been met on the cliff path by another person almost immediately, a younger person, who had come up the path from the village side. Hamish leaned forward slightly. A man or a woman? Morag's eyes met his. He wasn't certain. The light was going and he was frightened. He said, and these were his words, it could have been either. Hamish drove to see Fiona McRae that same afternoon, taking a different approach than on his previous visits. He chose the walk rather than the Land Rover, which gave him time to think and gave his arrival the appearance of something incidental. He found Fiona at the harbour end of the hotel building, examining the window that had been forced in the break-in, which had been repaired but which she was looking at with the expression of someone who is not thinking about window frames. He fell in beside her with the comfortable unhurriedness of a man who has nowhere pressing to be. "How's the investigation going?" Fiona asked without looking at him. "It's going," Hamish said. "I've been learning a great deal about the summer of 1989. She said nothing. "The Dunmore land is worth considerably more than it was then," Hamish continued in the musing tone of someone thinking aloud. "Planning laws have changed. Coastal development is a different proposition than it was. Your hotel is doing well." "Well enough," she said carefully. "Your family's finances were difficult in 1989, though. I've been looking at the rates records. There was a period of real strain." He was watching her from the corner of his eye with the peripheral attention of someone who has learned that direct observation changes what it observes. It would have been a hard time for a young woman trying to hold a family business together. Fiona turned from the window at last. Her face was still composed, still carefully arranged, but something behind the arrangement was working harder than before. "Is there a question in all of this, Constable Macbeth?" "Not yet," said Hamish pleasantly. "Just thinking." He walked home in the early dark with the wind off the loch cold against his face, and Lugs finding things of absorbing interest in every passing gateway, and the shape of the second crime assembling itself in his mind with the cold, unhurried precision of something that has always been there, waiting for him to look at it directly. A tall, well-dressed man on the cliff path, which described Malcolm Grant precisely. A second person arriving from the village side almost immediately, who could have been either. Fiona McRae, 24 years old in 1989, whose family hotel stood on the edge of land whose disputed ownership gave Malcolm Grant considerable leverage over people who might otherwise have spoken. The shape of it was almost complete. Almost. Chapter 9. The Witness Who Stayed Silent. It was Angela Brodie who mentioned Mrs. McLean. This was not in itself unusual. Angela had, over the years, become an informal but extraordinarily reliable source of information about the human geography of Lochdubh, not through any deliberate intelligence gathering, but simply through being the kind of person to whom other people naturally talked, particularly in the circumstances of illness or difficulty that brought them into contact with her husband's practice. She had a quality of genuine attention that was rarer than it appeared, and more valued than most people knew how to articulate. Hamish had called in on Saturday morning on the pretext of returning a casserole dish that had been in his possession since the previous spring, and that both parties had tacitly agreed to treat as a permanent loan rather than address the awkwardness of its extended absence. Angela accepted it without comment and offered coffee, which Hamish accepted, and they sat in the bright cluttered kitchen while Luggs renewed his acquaintance with the Brodies' cat, a large and phlegmatic tabby named Ptolemy, who had long since ceased to find the dog's enthusiasm either alarming or interesting. Hamish had not asked about Mrs. McLean. He had been describing, in the edited and general terms he used when thinking aloud to Angela, the difficulty of witnesses whose reliability was compromised by age, fear, or the simple human instinct to protect those they were loyal to. It was in response to this general observation, rather than any specific question, that Angela set down her coffee and said, in the offhand manner of someone accessing a peripheral memory, "You know, you might try speaking to Ina McLean, Angus's sister. She's been bedridden for 2 years now, but her mind is perfectly sound. She doesn't talk much, never did, but she sees everything from that bedroom window of hers. Has done for decades." Hamish looked at her. "Her bedroom window faces the cliff path. Has the best view of the upper cliff in the village, practically. She once described to me the precise pattern of a pair of oyster catchers nesting on the ledge for 3 successive springs, in considerable ornithological detail." Angela refilled her cup. If anything happened on that cliff, Ina McLean had a good chance of seeing it. Hamish drove to Angus McLean's cottage that afternoon, arriving at 2 o'clock with a tin of shortbread that Mrs. Wellington had pressed upon him earlier in the week, for reasons of pastoral generosity, and that he had been meaning to find a use for. Angus answered the door with the unsurprised expression that was becoming his signature response to Hamish's appearances, and led him without comment to the back room, where Ina lived her careful, curtailed life. The room was small and warm, and arranged with the orderly practicality of someone who has had to think carefully about the organisation of his reduced world. Books were stacked within arm's reach of the bed. A pair of good binoculars sat on the window-sill with the ease of a familiar tool. The window itself faced northwest, and through it Hamish could see the upper cliff path with the particular clarity of a view that has been looked at so often it has become an extension of the room. Ina McLean was 80, small-boned and white-haired, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had aged into something better, more particular, more legible, the features sharpened by time into an expression of permanent and unsentimental attention. She regarded Hamish from her pillows with eyes that were sharp and dark and not remotely surprised to see him. "You've come about the girl," she said. "I have," said Hamish. He sat in the chair beside the bed that had clearly been placed there for visitors, and offered her the shortbread, which she accepted with the directness of someone who sees no point in false modesty about biscuits. "I wondered how long it would take," Ina said. "After they found her up there, I thought, he'll come eventually, that Macbeth, because he's the one who doesn't stop." This was, Hamish felt, one of the more accurate assessments of his professional character he had encountered, and he received it with appropriate modesty. "Tell me what you saw," he said. She told him. She had been unable to sleep on the night in question. This was, she explained, a chronic condition of that particular period of her life, unrelated to guilt or premonition, simply the ordinary insomnia of a woman of 43 managing a difficult year. She had been sitting at the window in the dark, which she did sometimes when sleep refused to come, because the view of the cliff and the loch at night was one of the things she genuinely loved about the room she'd occupied all her adult life. She had not been watching with any particular purpose. She had simply been there. She had seen Clara Hastings on the path. She had known who it was because she had seen the young Englishwoman walking that path several times during her stay at the hotel, and because Clara had a particular way of moving, purposeful, slightly fast, leaning slightly into the wind, that was distinctive enough to recognise at a distance in reasonable light. There was still light in the sky at that hour, the long late gloaming of a Highland August. A man had been on the path ahead of her, waiting. He had been well dressed, tall, dark coat. They had argued. Ina could not hear the words at that distance, but the posture of argument was unmistakable. The sharp gestures, the close facing, the particular quality of stillness that precedes a sudden movement. He had pushed her. Ina described it with the flatness of someone recounting a fact that has been recounted many times in private, and has passed beyond the reach of shock into something colder and more permanent. Clara had gone over the edge of the cliff path where the ground fell steeply toward the grave site above the lower cliff. Not the sheer drop to the rocks, Hamish noted, but the steep unstable slope where a fall could be arranged to look accidental, and a body could be quickly buried in the soft ground above the old gorse line. The man had looked down after her, had stood very still for a moment, and then, from the village side of the path, a second figure had come up quickly. Not running, but moving with the urgent purposefulness of someone who had been expected, or who had heard the argument and followed. "A man or a woman?" Hamish asked, as he had asked Morag. "A woman," Ina said, without hesitation. Hamish kept his face entirely neutral. "You're certain?" "I am. The light was going, aye, but she was closer than he had been. I could see the shape of her clearly enough. Young, dark hair. She wore a red jacket." Ina's mouth pressed briefly together. "I knew who she was." The room was very quiet. The binoculars on the windowsill caught a thin line of afternoon light. "Why did you stay silent?" Hamish said, and kept every trace of judgment out of the question, because this was not the moment for it, and because, in 37 years of carrying this, Ina McLean had served her own sentence. "Because she was from here," Ina said simply, "and the girl was not." She paused. "And because the man frightened me. I knew what he was capable of. Everyone did, whether they admitted it or not." She looked at her hands on the coverlet. "And because Angus said to me, when I told him what I had seen the next morning, he said, 'Ina, if you speak of this, it will not go well for you, or for me, or for this family,' and I believed him." A silence. He was not wrong at the time. Whether he was right to say it, that is another question. Hamish thought of Angus and his careful, accurate memory, his description of voices on the cliff path, his single sharp line about how things ended badly in small places when questions were asked. The old man had known far more than he had said, and had said exactly enough to point Hamish in the right direction without putting himself at the centre of it. It was a Highland calculation of remarkable precision, and Hamish found he could not entirely condemn it. "The woman in the red jacket," Hamish said. He kept his voice level as still water. "Fiona MacRae." Ina looked at him. "Aye," she said quietly. "Fiona MacRae." Hamish sat with her for another 20 minutes, going over the details with the care they deserved, and then he thanked her and said goodbye, and walked out through Angus's garden in the grey afternoon, with the binoculars of an insomniac woman and 37 years of silence settling into place around the final, completed shape of what had happened on that cliff. We protect our own. He had heard that principle all his life in every form it took, from the trivial to the devastating. He had never found it easy to condemn outright. People protected their own out of love, out of fear, out of the particular intimacy of shared geography that makes strangers into abstractions and neighbours into something that must be preserved at almost any cost. Almost. Dougal Ferguson had not been a stranger. He had been their own. And someone had put him in his boat with a blow to the base of the skull, and arranged a whisky bottle beside him, and left him in the dark harbour water. That, Hamish thought, was where the principle had finally consumed itself. He called Strathbane from the Land Rover and asked for Blair. It was time to arrange a gathering. Chapter 10. The Last Guest Revealed. Hamish had chosen the Sutherland Arms for reasons that were partly practical and partly the kind of instinct that he had learned, over many years, not to dismiss. The practical reason was that the hotel had a private dining room, rarely used, slightly musty, furnished with the ambitious formality of a room that had once hoped for wedding parties, and had settled for the occasional Rotary dinner, that could accommodate 8 people without the conversation bleeding out into the bar. The instinctive reason was simpler. Clara Hastings had slept here, eaten breakfast here every morning for 11 days, sat in that bar and smiled at people who were deciding, for reasons of money and loyalty and fear, how much of what they knew to share. It seemed right, in a way that Hamish could not have defended to Blair but did not need to, that the matter should end here. Blair had been persuaded to attend, which had required the careful deployment of the word arrest, and the implication that credit for a solved double homicide would accrue to the investigating senior officer. He arrived with Detective Constable Mackenzie, who was young and competent and had developed the stoic resignation of someone who does good work in the shadow of a man who takes credit for it with the naturalness of breathing. Blair settled at one end of the table with the expression of a man who has been told a great deal and understood approximately 2/3 of it, but intends to convey authority throughout. They gathered at 7 in the evening in the amber light of a lamps that Fiona McRae had lit herself before taking her seat, with the automatic hospitality of a woman managing her own establishment even now. Alistair Grant sat across the table with the composed exhaustion of a man who has spent a week sleeping badly and has made a certain peace with that fact. Morag Sinclair sat beside him with her hands folded and her eyes steady, carrying her portion of the evening's weight with the quiet fortitude that had characterized everything she had brought to Hamish's investigation. Angus MacLean was present because Hamish had felt it necessary, and because Angus had, when Hamish called for him, put on his good jacket without being asked, which told its own story. Fiona McRae sat at the head of the table nearest the door, which she had arranged for herself without thinking, and which Hamish had permitted without comment. He stood at the far end by the window that looked out over the dark harbour, and he laid it all out. He did it without theatre and without haste, in the methodical way he had always found most effective, not building to revelations, but simply establishing the truth in its correct sequence, so that by the time he reached the conclusion, it felt not like an accusation, but like an arrival. Clara Hastings, the Edinburgh research, the Dunbar land transfer, the fraudulent signatures, her 11 days in Lochdubh verifying what she had found, her conversation with Alistair Grant at the door of his father's house, Malcolm Grant on the cliff path in the August dark. He described Callum Sinclair's account, delivered to his sister in grief and whisky 12 years after the fact. He described Ina McLean at her window, the binoculars she had not needed because the light had been sufficient and the path had been close enough, and she had known the woman in the red jacket from a lifetime of proximity. He did not look at Fiona while he said this. He looked at the table, at his notebook, at the middle distance, as one does when reading out facts that have been established beyond contest. The room was very quiet. Malcolm Grant pushed Clara Hastings, Hamish said. She fell down the steep slope above the lower cliff. She did not, in all probability, die from the fall. She died from what happened after it. He paused. This was the part he had thought about most carefully. You came up the path from the village, he said, and now he did look at Fiona steadily and without hostility. You had followed her, or followed him, or both. I don't know which, and it may not matter. What matters is that you arrived on that cliff, and you found a situation that had already gone beyond what anyone could undo, and you made a decision. Fiona's face had not changed in any way that could be called dramatic. It had simply become very still, in the way of faces that have stopped managing themselves because the management has become too expensive. Malcolm Grant had leverage over your family, Hamish continued. The hotel land, the finances. He was the kind of man who collected obligations the way other men collect debts, and he knew how to call them in. He kept his voice level. I don't think you came to that cliff intending what happened. I think you came because you were frightened, and because he had sent for you, or because you had understood from Alistair's telephone call what was about to happen and you couldn't stop it. And when you arrived, it was already too late to stop it, but not too late to make a choice about what came next. Morag Sinclair made a small, involuntary sound. Angus looked at the tablecloth. You helped stage it, Hamish said. You helped bury her. You took the documents from the suitcase, the evidence she had carried, and between you made a young woman from Exeter disappear into the Highland earth as though she had never existed. He paused. And then you went home, and you kept the hotel, and the land stayed in the Grant family, and 37 years passed. The amber lamplight sat on the table between them like something physical. And then the storm came, Hamish said quietly. And Dougal Ferguson looked at the news from the cliff and made a calculation, as men do when the thing they've been afraid of finally surfaces, and he said something, or threatened something, or simply let it be known that his silence had a renewed cost, and you couldn't pay it. Fiona closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, something had gone out of her face that had been there through every previous conversation. The watchfulness, the careful architecture of composure. What remained was older and more exhausted, and, Hamish thought, in its way more real than anything he had seen from her before. I didn't know he was going to push her, she said. Her voice was low and entirely steady, which was in some respects worse than if it had not been. I want that understood. I went up there because Malcolm telephoned the hotel and told me to come, and I went because I was 24 years old and he owned half of what my family needed to survive, and I went because I thought I could. She stopped. I thought I could prevent something. I was wrong. And Dougal, Blair said from his end of the table, because even Blair understood when a moment required something from him. Dougal had seen more than he ever said. Not everything, not what Ina saw, but enough. He'd been on the lower path that night and he'd seen Malcolm's car and he'd seen me coming back through the village afterward. Her hands lay flat on the table. After the cliff discovery, he came to me. He wasn't asking for money. He was asking me to go to the police. She paused. He said he couldn't carry it anymore, that finding her up there had changed something for him. She said nothing more after that. She did not need to. The silence in the room was complete and particular, the silence of people sitting with the full weight of something that has been uncovered and cannot be recovered. Blair nodded to Mackenzie, who produced the necessary words with professional efficiency and a personal expression of something that was not quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it. Fiona McRae stood and received the caution with a composure that had nothing performative left in it, only the bare dignity of someone who has stopped running and is standing still at last. Hamish stayed after the others had gone. He sat alone in the private dining room for a while, in the amber light with the harbour dark outside the window, and he thought about a girl who had taken her breakfast at 8 every morning and asked too many questions and died for the straightforward crime of being right. He thought about Callum Sinclair, dead at 53 of a guilt he never put down. He thought about Ina at her window, and Angus with his careful half-truths, and Dougal in his boat wanting to confess to a woman who had killed him for it. He walked home through Lochdubh in the cold, clean air of a late autumn night, the loch black and still on his left, the village lights warm and small against the dark. Lugs appeared from the direction of the police station with the focused urgency of a dog who has been indoors for 4 hours and has opinions about this, and fell into step beside him with the easy reliability that Hamish had always found, quietly and without making a great deal of it, one of the better things in his life. The village would carry this for a while. It would carry it in the way that small places carry difficult things, absorbing them slowly, re-knitting around them, not forgetting but in time ceasing to speak of them in the present tense. Memory was long in the Highlands. Truth, it turned out, was longer. Hamish stood at the edge of the loch for a moment and looked at the water and the dark shape of the hills beyond. Then he turned for home, lugs at his heel, and the lights of Lochdubh quiet at his back. The last guest, he thought, had finally left.